So when we're talking about burning down the haystack, right, we're trying to get rid of all the hay. Mythbusters did a thing on this, right, where they said, hey, how do we find the needle in the haystack? A couple different ways. They actually found the best way was if you take the hay and you put it on top of water and you let the needle sink to the bottom, but who wants to listen to a talk titled, let's put the hay on top of the water, right, find the needle? No, it wasn't as cool. So burning down the haystack, we're going to get to that. All right, so first a little bit about me. Where did I come from? Army. I spent some time in the Army, did electrical engineering in college, Cisco networking. I got into InfoSec after I started breaking some stuff, figuring out how important it is to build things, right? Does anybody remember the first time you cracked WEP? Anybody? That was a great experience when it's like this is actually being still used in the early to mid 2000s, and so I'd find some networks and it was like, oh, I can crack WEP? That was crazy. Practicing on my home network. What are you guys thinking? Anyway, so I started realizing that building stuff was more what I wanted to do than breaking stuff, but seeing how easily it was to break, decided I need to build. So I did some stuff in the DoD as well as the electricity sector, started building and assembling the SOC tool sets. And once I started putting the things in place, right, your SIEM, your IDSs, your log management, your infrastructure, all that stuff, the tools, everything started blowing up. And then I realized, hey, I need to do some Python scripting so that I can actually maintain these tools and I can actually do something to make sense of all the information that's coming out of this, right? So that's fast forward, that's what I do today full time, is work on helping organizations automate their processes, right? A couple certifications there. The haystack, let's talk about this. So this is what it feels like to me, whether it's like you can think of this as like the Matrix or your alert console on your SIEM, right? They look about the same. So you start seeing this stuff just rolling through and you're like, how do I deal with this? Oh my gosh, it just starts becoming noise after a while, you know? I used to think I could see the blondes and the brunettes and the redheads, but no, I can't. So, you know, the guy from the Matrix thought he could do it, but you really can't. At some point, it just all becomes noise. So we've got to figure out a way to deal with the basic stuff, right? I love that I'm following the guy on the threat hunting stuff because this is not threat hunting, okay? This is how you free up some of your time to do threat hunting, all right? Is you've got to deal with this stuff like he talked about. This is the toil. This is the grind that we all have to deal with. So how do we get past it? What do we do? Well, we could hire more people, right? It's a great thing to do, and everybody's hiring. But as my favorite comic illustrates, that's a hard thing to do. So good luck with that, right? Even if you get the head count at your organization, trying to hire, maintain, retain the talent, and do all the things that you need to do to keep those people at your organization is going to be difficult. What's next? More better tools. That's me right there, by the way. I was the Leonidas that said, like, I want the more tools, give me more stuff, right? More blinky lights, let's get it in there. So get all the things in. Pretty soon, your signal-to-noise ratio just gets blown out of the water, right? You've got all this fancy stuff. You've got some things running off, giving you the information. You got to stay ahead of the attackers. You got to do the next best detection thing, but the signal-to-noise ratio is the problem. All right, of course we need better processes, but every organization has them, right? And like my big friend, Big Lebowski, that's just like your opinion, man. So when somebody comes in and tells you how to do your process better, right, everybody's got opinions on how to do processes better. So we got to get them better, but that's not going to fix the problem. So is it time for something new? Right? It's not really new. Automation's been around for a while, but just not very heavily leveraged in security. So how do we think about this and bring it in security, what we need to do? I'm going to talk about two aspects of it, right? My colleague Rob talked about SOAR yesterday, where you throw in the R on the response, but I'm going to focus on the automation and orchestration stuff today, right? So where do we actually, the orchestration sitting between the tools and the automation doing it at machine speed. So, ladies and gentlemen, brace yourselves. Automation is coming. All right, so definitions. Machine-based execution of one or more security actions. That's the automation piece, right? A lot of people throw that term out today very frequently. When we think about automation, it's not, you can think of IDS as automation. You can think of SIEM as automation. All these tools have an aspect of automation, but what I'm talking about here today is tasks that would normally have to be accomplished by analysts, right? Things that somebody would manually have to do. We've kind of done a pretty good job of automating that log analysis and stuff. That's what we have SIEM for. We don't watch packets as they stream across the network anymore, right? That's what IDS is for. That's what some of these other things are going. Orchestration is the glue that sits between the tools across a complex infrastructure, right? So in typical SOC, you may have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 tools, right? You've got all these things that provide information, that provide detection capabilities, alerts, information. They're part of your investigative sources. They could be other IT tools like your email system, your server logs, your LDAP, right? Your Active Directory. So you're trying to get information from these, and as part of your investigation, you have to orchestrate across those things. Now, a couple quick caveats, what it's not. Not a replacement for human analysts, okay? We're not talking about getting rid of people. It's not a silver bullet or a unicorn, right? And it's not more blinky lights. This is not something that you set and forget. It's not something that's going to solve all your problems. This is something that's going to help you save some time, right? That's really what it boils down to. All right, so when I said not a replacement for human analysts, let's talk about this for a second. David Autor did a TED Talk in September 2016, really great talk. You should all check it out if you haven't. He says, why are there so many jobs still if we've got all this automation, right, across industries? He uses the example of the ATM and the bank teller machine, right, where bank tellers used to have to distribute cash, right? Well, in 1970, when the ATM came along, bank tellers were really worried about, well, what's going to happen to my job, right? Is it going to go away? Well, the number of bank tellers between 1970 to 2000s, the early 2000s, actually doubled, right? So you had way more of those bank tellers, but their job didn't look the same, right? So what it does is it evolves the job. So it doesn't take it away, but it says now it's not just looking at some of the same tier 1 alerts, the same phishing emails, the same things. It's actually making it more complex what you have to accomplish, right? So it takes a higher level of cognitive ability, more of the soft skills, other things like that. We've talked a lot about in this conference about interfacing with people, right? Using that human API. That's a big thing that's going to become more and more necessary in our analysts. All right, so like I said, I hinted at earlier, and Rob talked about this yesterday, so I won't spend too much time on this. When we think about the OODA loop, right, we're trying to make this tighter. That's what the idea behind automation orchestration, when we're reducing this time that it takes between when something comes in and we see it and to the endpoint when we act, right? If we can keep that OODA loop tighter, then we're going to win. So how do we burn down the haystack, right? Let's start lighting some stuff on fire. What are we trying to accomplish, right? Let's think about our goal. Are we trying to triage phishing emails? This is one of the top use cases for automation. Are we trying to remediate common malware? Are we trying to do routine intel updates or common ticketing tasks, right? All these things that we need to do that happen over and over again. But let's focus on one. It's also helpful if you can think about the scenario where you spend the majority of your time, right? By saving or by focusing on a scenario that takes you a lot of time, then you end up saving more time, right? And then that has downstream effects. So follow the steps, go to the whiteboard, right? Start diagramming it out. Start figuring out what it is that actually makes up this process. Now, you're building your documents and your diagrams. You're kind of thinking about a flow chart, right? You're thinking about the different actions that you're taking. You're thinking about the different decisions that you're doing, right? As you're walking through this, think about the time that you're going to spend on each step. And then you're going to be able to calculate ROI and say, look, by automating this process, this is what we get back. This is the amount of time that we're saving from doing this, right? And then if you multiply that by the number of times per day, then you get the goal. So the end state is that you get playbooks, right? That you build these things out together, and these can be built in. You can diagram it on a whiteboard. You can do it in Visio. You can do it wherever, right? You're just trying to understand your process and lay it out step by step. All right. So how do you actually get started? You need a couple repetitive processes, right? You can't really automate something if you don't know what you're doing. You have to peel those back. So let me talk about that for a second. You kind of like I hinted at the previous slides, you can't just kind of surface level, well, I just want to, remediate all my SIEM alerts. Well, that's not really going to do you any good. You didn't think about what are the individual steps, right? Do you take a SIEM alert? Do you look up information on virus total? Do you do internal context where you look up stuff on DNS? Find out the host name, find out the owning business unit. Do you have to contact someone? Do you have to send a notification? What are the discrete steps that you have to go through, right? So really peel that back. Now, if you want to do this effectively, you also need security tools with APIs. If your tools don't have APIs, you're not really going to get very far, right? You're not going to be able to get the action against those tools that you need to accomplish. More and more tools have these, so you're in luck, right? People are starting to get the message is that they have to have this, right? If they don't have APIs, then they don't scale well. You also need some scripting knowledge, right? So personally, Python is my language. It's becoming the most popular language. That's the latest and greatest, is that it's exceeding some of the other ones out there like Java and JavaScript. Familiar with request module in Python to do API interactions, some sort of data management, web service, how are you going to interact with this, right? So kind of building the framework of those pieces. Other languages are fine too. Like if you want to use PowerShell, if you want to use Ruby, JavaScript, there's a lot of things out there that can do this type of stuff, but I've found that Python has the most easy to pick up modules, and it becomes more like Legos, right? Building blocks. Just like my 5-year-old son, love me some Legos. So Other thing I'll mention too is that optionally there are platforms out there, right? There's free community editions. So if literally you go out there and Google it, community security automation orchestration, boom, you can download at least 2 different ones that I know of off the top of my head. The benefit of these is that they're going to rapidly accelerate your time to value, right? They've built a lot of the plumbing that you need to actually talk to your security tools, the common ones that are in the majority of SOCs, right? The major COTS vendors. So it's going to reduce the amount of scripting knowledge you need. It doesn't eliminate it, right? You still have to know what you're doing. But the low-level plumbing is there to really accelerate it. All right, so now let's get into the fun part. Everybody really loves this, the success example, right? So do your best, success kid. Here we go. All right, MSSP security event triage. We were working for a managed security service provider, and they wanted to do the same thing every time a certain set of events came in, right? They found that they would want to do a check in their ticketing system to see if a ticket had already been created. If a ticket was there, then they would link that to the incident. If a ticket was not there, they would create a new ticket, right? They would also query their SIEM to get the results that applied to that particular event, and then they would update that ticket with a CSV of the query results, right? They would have that ready to go. That was something that took a long time, that every time an analyst logged on, saw a ticket, they would have to pivot over, query their SIEM, get the results back, and make it look at it. So by doing this, by having it in the ticket, as soon as the analyst came to look at it, that saved them about 3 to 5 minutes per event. Well, for an MSSP, that's huge, right? Because they're dealing with tons of these every day. So great success story there. Another one was phishing email triage. So like I mentioned earlier, this is like one of the most common use cases, right? This is something that even more so than your SIEM alert console, right? You're dealing with these phishing emails that come in from other people in your organization. They say, hey, is this phishing? It's from my cousin Bob, or it's from the Nigerian prince, or whatever, right? And you've got to sit there and go through and find the link in it, and you got to detonate that, or do some screen captures of it, or you got to take the attachment and actually figure out what it's doing. So rather than have to do that manually, why not have something monitoring that email box, pull it in, and actually start going through and doing that, right? Regex parse the indicators out of there, and then start submitting those to a sandbox or to a threat intel service, right? Couple cool things about this particular one is they would do these reputation actions like I'm talking about on the URL, on the file hash. They would maybe even submit their file to a sandbox to detonate it, get the results back. They were able to actually integrate with Duo as a multi-factor form of approval so that they could, if they found some malicious pieces in the email, they could actually send an approval push to Duo. The analyst could look at it and say, yes, this exceeded the threshold, and they could click a button and have it implement the countermeasures. So they could block hashes using FireAmp, and they could block domains on OpenDNS, right? Again, it's all about tightening the OODA loop, making it to where you can take that action faster and you can counteract the adversary, what they're trying to accomplish. Again, some people bring up the concern of like, okay, well, wait a minute, I got people on my mobile phone, like blocking stuff, wait a minute, that's gonna cause problems. Well, yes, I mean, there is potential for self-inflicted wounds, but which one are you more willing to take, right? Which is the bigger risk? And are you giving people the tools and knowledge, and are you setting up the decision-making criteria in here such that it exceeds thresholds, that if it's known bad, we're gonna go ahead and deal with it? Well then, yeah, your risk of somebody causing problems is going to be lower than the risk of leaving it out there unremediated. All right, another one. Software company wanted to do some domain blocking, and they wanted to do it without having to interface with the user interface for their, in this case, I think it was like OpenDNS, or it's now called Cisco Umbrella, right? So they said they wanted to be able to just have an email that was sent to an email box with the domain in the email that they wanted to block, and boom, it would take care of it, right? So again, it made it easy for them to implement this on the fly. They were a short-staffed team that said, they have their analysts that aren't able to sit in front of the console all the time. If they get something coming in that they need to deal with, they need to be able to do it quickly, right? So, financial company hash hunting. They were starting with a list of hashes. So again, this is a common problem. You get an Intel bulletin. You get something that comes in and says, hey, here's 1,600 different hashes that are bad. What are you going to do with that, right? Are you going to try to figure out if they're on your endpoints? How are you going to do that with 1,600 of them? Are you going to do 1,600 manual queries in your endpoint detection and response tool? I don't think so, right? So how are you going to set that up to say, we're using an endpoint platform that doesn't have the containment API. Even if we found one, what would we be able to do with it? So by integrating with different components, they checked with their EDR tool to find out if the hash showed up on an endpoint, but then they were able to leverage Windows Remote Management or actions directly on the endpoint to perform some of that containment, like deleting the file or blocking the process, right? So by thinking about an orchestration, the sum of the parts is greater than its whole, right? By bringing the different capabilities of your tools together, sometimes you can shore up maybe what's a gap in one tool by leveraging something else that you have through orchestration. All right, phishing email analysis. So this again was a retail company that wanted to deal with some mailboxes that they had that were getting phishing emails. Now the interesting thing that they had in this case was they were getting some emails directly from their users, and they were getting some emails that were filtering through PhishMe Triage, right? So they were having some of the URLs being rewritten, which is an interesting problem to solve, right? So how do you think about if you got rewritten URLs, now I've got to deal with those, and they were coming to the same place. So when you're automating off of those emails, you have to then think about identifying the different types of them and treating those differently, right? So again, it's part of the automation process of saying, hey, if we find that these regexes have been, or I'm sorry, these URLs have been rewritten, now then we got to extract those and treat them differently. We got to rewrite them back to something that we can use to check a reputation service or to detonate in a sandbox, right? Now, they were able to then automate the escalation notification process appropriately, and with this particular retail company, they were getting so many of these a day that you're talking about massive time savings, right? When they're getting 100 to 500 of these every day, and you're able to automate that process of dealing with it, now that frees up tons of analyst time, and they're able to get to all those alerts. One of the things I didn't mention earlier that I wanted to talk about is there was a recent survey from Enterprise Strategy Group that said 54% of organizations admit to ignoring alerts that are worthy of further investigation because they simply don't have the staff or resources to do it, right? So you can see that, I mean, there was many of these cases where these emails, they would just have to take a quick look and try to deal with it, or frankly, just in some cases, it would get ignored. So being able to address all these, again, reduce the risk, freed up more time, big benefit. This was an interesting one, alert suppression, right? So how would you deal with that if you've got alerts that you don't want to handle at your SIEM, right? So some cases a SIEM may be good at this, some cases it may be bad at this, right? If you have the ability to suppress it there, that's probably going to be ideal, but if you can't, then what are you going to do with it, right? You want to keep those things firing, but you only want to be notified if there's so many of them, or if there's such a threshold of something that happens beyond what you can deal with. So we were able to handle that. There was another case for alert suppression at a bank. They wanted to do the same thing, except they wanted to suppress it for 24 hours, right? So they said, hey, if this alert fires on this particular workstation and this particular user, then don't tell me again about it for another 24 hours. I'll deal with it then later. So the differences in these two alert suppression things were different SIEMs, different goals of what they were trying to accomplish, and different levels of escalation, right? So the idea of being able to do that without having the capability native to your SIEM was a big benefit of being able to automate and orchestrate this type of stuff. Okay, this was an interesting case too. So they had a malware repository at a large bank. They wanted to check their Intel file hashes that they got. So a list of file hashes came in, right? Another common problem. They wanted to check against their two AV engines using VirusTotal, right? So they were running two different antivirus engines within the bank. If their AV didn't detect it, they would actually download the file from VirusTotal and then send it to the AV vendor for adding to their .dat file, right? And they would say, hey, AV vendor, you're not detected on this. We need you to go ahead and pick this up, right? So it was interesting that their model, they wanted to make sure that they were detecting that stuff, and they were making sure that they were keeping up with their Intel hashes. The other thing they were sensitive to is where it started to get even more advanced is they wanted to prevent their VirusTotal license overuse, right? So they had a limited number of VirusTotal lookups, and if they had checked something within the last 7 days, they didn't want to check it again. So again, another thing that they could keep track of, a great case to use, and so they could say, hey, I'm not having to do this again because I know that I did it before. This one was a great example. They were getting a lot of different alerts, and they were using email, which is not the greatest way to triage these, but they were getting it into an email box, and they were having to review these, and they were having to say, hey, for different types of emails, how do we deal with the different types of alerts? So being able to monitor the email inbox and say, if it's a certain type of alert, send it one way, do one playbook. If it's another type of alert, send it another way, do a different playbook, right? So that was the idea of doing object-oriented playbook writing. And this was kind of like what Rob was talking about yesterday when you think about a playbook methodology, right? You give yourself the ability to reuse playbooks where you focus on file analysis playbook. You focus on a specific type of event playbook. that allows you to say, hey, I'm going to do these different aspects, and then I'm going to go back and document everything in the main central place. So it handled the variety of alerts in a detailed fashion. All right. So this was one specific type of alert. They brought it in. I know it's not readable on the specific things there, but the idea is that they were able to bring it in, and they were able to launch some specific malware bytes remediation scans. They were able to resolve it. They were able to update it, tag it, send notifications back out. So, I mean, again, the common processes, the themes, right, is being able to update tickets, being able to check things that would have to be manually checked, prevent somebody from having to open 16 tabs in a browser, right, on 6 different monitors and check all these things that they would spend their time doing. It allows you to handle it systematically and fast through automation. All right, so another phishing types of investigations. It starts to sound like a little bit of repeat, but again, this is such a common thing. This one was interesting that they wanted to check for a couple preconditions at first, right? So they used a whitelist, said, hey, if any of these domains or any of these emails are on our whitelist, we're not going to deal with that, right? So just get rid of a bunch of hay right there. If they started detonating the files and the URLs, they would then check for the thresholds that they wanted to be notified about, right? So again, common process, common thing that they needed to accomplish, and then they would get notified those if they were above the certain threshold. So there was another healthcare company that wanted to do a similar process, right? Again, phishing investigation. But the difference is that every organization wants to approach this slightly different, right? Which is why you have different playbooks, you have different tool sets that you're integrating with, and all this type of thing. So they started with the emails. They checked to ensure the email was attached. This is, again, another common problem, right? If every time somebody forwards in an email, you don't get all those headers on the front. So I was part of a SOC that was having to reply back to people and say, hey, could you please send the email in, but drag it as an attachment and put it in the email so that we get all the headers, right? What if you had a way that detected if there was only one email and there wasn't two, there wasn't an attachment of that it would reply back to them and say, thank you for submitting, but please follow these instructions, right? Please attach it to the email, drag it in, don't just forward the one that you think is bad, right? I mean, that saved them a ton of time right there, just being able to automatically respond to those and get people trained up to do the right thing. Had the instructions printed out once, they only had to set that up once, and then boom, it's on autopilot, right? After that, once they had both emails, they were able to perform those reputation actions, the SIEM queries, and then escalate and respond as necessary. There was a logistics company that had a very interesting use case. They, again, received a lot of phishing emails. They wanted to do more than just check stuff and see if it was bad, right? They wanted to actually purge that and be able to quickly do so. They were leveraging Office 365, so they had all their emails in the cloud. So we set up some scripts for them, and again, we leveraged a lot, not just Python, but a lot of PowerShell, Windows Remote Management, and Office 365 Security and Compliance Center to actually kick off some purge jobs, right? So if they had an email gateway monitoring tool that basically said if an email was bad or if a link was bad, it got through, they would then use that as the detection event to kick off this workflow. And so they were able to reach in, to search for everybody's email box, kick off a security and compliance search to find everywhere where that email showed up and actually kick off the purge, right? And have several approval steps and check steps along the way to make sure that those series of things that needed to be done were accomplished. This one was a good one from an insurance company. They wanted to do some registry key investigations. So they were leveraging their SIEM and a combination of endpoint monitoring that they wanted to actually see every time a registry key got added to the registry run key that they were tracking, right? So that would pop up. Now you could imagine that could generate a lot of false positives, but it also would be something of interest, right? So in order to reduce the false positives and actually get through some of this stuff, they would, every time one of those things came in, they would initiate the file acquisition on the endpoint, they would pull the file in, they would then send the file over to their sandbox and detonate it, and then they would check the results of that sandbox detonation, right? So you have the whole workflow that was being able to be done every time, and so they would only see something of interest if it was above a certain score threshold from that sandbox, right? So if they had 10 of these a day or 20 of these a day that were coming in, now they maybe only had 1 or 2 that they actually had to look at that were interesting, that when they detonated in the sandbox, the file actually showed some potential malicious behavior, right? So again, getting rid of all the hay, finding the needle. Another one that they were doing around threat activity. So there was some SIEM alerts that they were matching an IOC. Now this was a specific IP address or a domain. Again, kind of like mentioned before, the pyramid of pain, these are not the best indicators because they can often result in false positives. But if you've got a list of these and you want to start checking this stuff, okay, how do we kind of cull that down and find the interesting piece? Well, we kick off a query into the SIEM. We find the actual proxy log where whenever someone visited that IP or that particular domain, what was the full URL that they were visiting, okay? Then at that point, you would kick that over to the sandbox, have that detonate, and find out if that URL that they actually visited was malicious, right? So again, it's all part of that process that would have to normally be done manually, but we're talking about automating it so that you don't have to sit there and do all those, and you only get notified or escalated of the ones that are more interesting, right? Kind of reduces some of that fatigue, that alert fatigue. So rather than have all these alerts that we can't deal with, we want to save time by using automation orchestration. So some key takeaways, right? It's going to save you time. It's going to reduce the hay by triaging and closing these things automatically in many cases, right? So I just gave you a lot of examples of doing that. You're going to be able to kind of deal with the common low-level ones so that you can have your time freed up to deal with the more advanced things, right? The point is not that you want to find the latest and greatest APT or the biggest threat. You want to be able to find the things that are more interesting. Go through the steps that you would normally do on an alert so that you don't have to do those by yourself, right? It's going to make your job less boring. It's going to hopefully reduce risk to your organization by addressing the alerts and the things that you normally wouldn't have time to do. Finally, think about the process that you need to automate, okay? That's going to be the key to this. If you again, try to just make it too broad or too general, you're not going to be successful. You're going to want to really get down to the specifics, get down to the individual nitty-gritty pieces so that you can say, hey, this is step A, B, C, and follow that rabbit all the way down. The next steps, besides thinking about those things and really thinking about your process, look into scripting, right? Look into scripting with APIs. Dealing with those types of things, that's a skill that's only getting more valuable. The other thing is the community SAO platforms. If you find that and you want to check it out, it's going to save you some time on getting into this space, but writing your own scripts and doing all this stuff on your own is completely possible, and there's many people that do it. So that's the key takeaways from my talk. I ended early, so you guys can thank me later.
Great. Thanks so much. Really appreciate that. Very interesting stuff.